Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware stands for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, May 23rd, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism that accompanies them, and that our government uses as an excuse for killing people around the world. The President of the United States was in the Mideast this week, promoting those wars, which he'd attacked in the campaign when they were being conducted by the Obama-Clinton administration. That was one of the reasons people voted for President Trump, but he's talking differently these days. Patrick Coburn, probably the best English language correspondent in the Middle East, described the president's speech in Saudi Arabia this week. It was crude stuff, Coburn wrote. President Trump called on 55 Muslim leaders assembled in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, to drive out terrorism from their countries. He identified Iran as a despotic state and came near to calling for regime change there, though Iran held a presidential election, generally regarded as fair, only 2 days previously. Trump denounced Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia organization, and lined up the U.S. squarely on the side of the Sunni branch of Islam against the Shia branch in the sectarian proxy war that is tearing apart the Middle East. The impact of U.S. presidential visits and speeches abroad are generally overrated and turn out to have far less influence than are claimed at the time. Barack Obama's speech in Cairo in 2009 about the conflicts in the region was more sophisticated than anything Mr. Trump said in Riyadh this week, but it turned out to denote no new departures in American policy. The same may turn out to be true of Mr. Trump's address. The most important aspect of Trump's two-day visit to Saudi Arabia is that it took place at all. He chose to go first to the world's most thoroughgoing autocracy, where his speech will be lauded by the state-controlled media. But the radicalism of what he said can be exaggerated because so far his policy towards Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and other countries in the region are so far little different from what Mr. Obama did in practice. Almost all of the 55 Muslim rulers and leaders in the vast hall at Riyadh will have breathed a little easier on hearing Mr. Trump's repeated call to, quote, drive out terrorism, since they've always described anybody who opposes their authority as terrorists. This will be a green light to people like Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi to go on imprisoning and torturing Muslim Brotherhood members. American pressure on the ruling Sunni majority in Bahrain to stop persecuting the Shia majority was always tame, but Mr. Trump's praise for the island's rulers may make the situation even worse. Mr. Trump's failure to refer to human rights abuses was criticized by some observers, but more serious than his words was his presence in Riyadh before an audience of autocrats. Saudi leaders will be pleased by Mr. Trump's condemnation of Iran as the fountainhead of terrorism. This was the most substantive part of the speech and is the one most likely to increase conflict. The Saudis will see it as a license to increase their support for proxy wars being waged against Shia movements and communities in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and beyond. Houthi militiamen in Yemen and Shia militiamen in Iraq and Syria are often referred to as Iranian-backed, which may or may not be true, but is their Shiism which is by far the most important determinant of their political identity. In targeting them, Mr. Trump is plugging the U.S. into the ferocious sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia, the two principal branches of Islam. This is not a war that is going to be won by either side, but the stance of the Trump administration will help ensure that it goes on being fought. Ever since Mr. Trump was elected, Iraqi leaders in Baghdad have been concerned that a deeper confrontation between the U.S. and Iran will further destabilize Iraq, just as the Iraqi security forces are getting control of the last enclaves of ISIS control in Mosul. An escalation of the war in Yemen by the Saudi-backed forces could close the port of Hodeidah on the Red Sea coast, through which is imported much of the food reaching the 17 million Yemenis on the verge of famine. In the last years of Mr. Obama, U.S. public opinion was increasingly focused on Saudi Arabia as the country most to blame for 9/11, because 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis, as was Osama bin Laden, and according to a CIA report, the private financing for the operation. Senior U.S. officials have repeatedly pointed to financing from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf as essential to the rise of ISIS and al-Qaeda-type organizations in Iraq and Syria. Mr. Trump himself blamed Saudi Arabia for 9/11 during the presidential election campaign, but this was all forgotten when he spoke in Riyadh. This might have two serious consequences. Leaders of the Shia community fear that ISIS may be nominally destroyed, but the bulk of its fighters would simply join other anti-Shia paramilitary movements in Iraq and Syria. As for driving out terrorism from Muslim societies, for which Mr. Trump called, one important aspect of the growth of al-Qaeda-type movements has been the way in which Saudi Arabia has used its oil wealth for half a century to spread Wahhabism, its puritanical and fanatical variant of Islam. This has become an increasingly predominant influence over mainstream Sunni Islam, increasing its sectarianism. That's what our government is supporting. Those of us in Aware, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, call upon President Trump instead to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, including Iran. 2, ending the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere and stopping the drone attacks. 3, cutting military spending by at least 50% and closing the more than 700 foreign military bases, either Russia nor China has more than 12, bring U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by pro-war people and the pro-war political establishment, Republican and Democrat alike. We'll try to give a better account tonight, beginning with Karen Aram and a pivot to Asia, right?
Before I pivot to Asia, though, Carl, which is why I brought the map in, I know this is an article that I just read this morning. I have posted it on my Facebook as well as, excuse me, on our Peace List. But I think it's worth going over because it supports what you're saying in respect to where we're headed with our domestic issues in relation to military spending. This comes from the World Socialist website, .org, and it's written by Kate Randall. The title is Trump Calls for $1.7 trillion in Social Cuts. The Trump administration will unveil a fiscal year 2018 budget today that includes $1.7 trillion in cuts to major social programs. The plan marks a new stage in a bipartisan social counter-revolution aimed at eviscerating what remains of programs to fight poverty and hunger and provide health care for millions of workers. The unveiling of the budget underscores the reactionary character of the Democrats' response to a gangster government headed by a fascistic-minded billionaire and composed of Wall Street bankers, far-right ideologues, and generals. The Democrat Party has chosen to base its opposition to Trump not on his assault on working and poor people, his attack on democratic rights, or his reckless militarism, but on his supposed softness toward Russia. In the political warfare in Washington, the Democrats are aligned with those sections of the intelligence apparatus and the deep state that are determined to compel Trump to abandon any notion of easing relations and instead continue the Obama administration's policy of escalating confrontation with Russia. As the Democrats and the so-called liberal media pursue their anti-Russia campaign, the Trump administration continues to advance its brutal domestic agenda. Trump's budget is the opening shot in a stage-managed tussle between the two big business parties over social cuts that will end with the most massive attack on core social programs in U.S. history. The budget includes a cut of $800 billion over a decade in Medicaid, the health insurance program for low-income people, jointly administered by the federal government and the states. More than 74 million Americans, or 1 in 5, are currently enrolled in Medicaid, including pregnant women, children, and seniors with disabilities. Like the American Health Care Act, AHCA, passed earlier this month by the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, Trump's budget plan would put an end to Medicaid as a guaranteed benefit based on need, replacing it with per capita funding or block grants to the states. The AHCA would also end the expansion of Medicaid benefits under Obamacare and allow states to impose work requirements for beneficiaries. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that an earlier version of the Republican plan would result in 10 million people being stripped of Medicaid benefits. Trump's budget would also cut $193 billion over a decade from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, which is commonly known as food stamps. Welfare benefits known as temporary assistance, I'm just paraphrasing it now. Welfare benefits known as temporary assistance for needy families would be cut by $21 billion. The budget reportedly includes changes in funding for Social Security Supplemental Security Income Program, which provides cash benefits to the poor and disabled. So while gutting social programs, Trump proposes to sharply reduce taxes for the wealthy. In addition to slashing income tax rates for the rich, he is proposing to dramatically cut estate, capital gains, and business tax rates. At the same time, he is demanding a huge increase in military spending. While Democrats will make rhetorical criticisms of the Trump budget, the fact is that the administration is escalating a decades-long assault on the working class overseen by both big business parties. The outcome can be seen in the reality of social life in America. Now, I'm going to skip all the information here related to poverty, hunger, lack of health care, a bipartisan assault. That's what's important for people to recognize. In the wake of Trump's budget proposal, the Democrats have responded with their standard empty rhetoric. Senate Minority Leader Charles Schumer, one of Congress' biggest recipients of Wall Street campaign money, decried Trump's hard-right policies that benefit the ultra-wealthy at the expense of the middle class. And just 3 weeks ago, Schumer and House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi were hailing the passage of a bipartisan fiscal 2017 budget that cut food stamps by $2.4 billion. They slashed funding for education and the environment and added billions more for the military and border control. Obamacare paved the way for the present assault on Medicaid and the coming attacks on Medicare and Social Security by further subordinating health care to the profit demands of the insurance and pharmaceutical industries and imposing higher cost for reduced benefits on millions of workers. So nothing less than a mass movement of the working class will prevent the destruction of Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, food stamps, public education, and every other social gain won by the working class. But this movement must be completely independent of the Democratic Party, the historic graveyard of social protest in America. And that includes left-talking demagogues like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. It's not a matter of appealing to or seeking to pressure the Democrats or any other section of the political establishment. They are all in the pocket of Wall Street. The working class needs its own program to secure its basic social rights: a decent paying job, education, health care, and a secure retirement. These rights are not compatible with a capitalist system that is lurching inexorably toward world war and dictatorship. So workers and youth must intervene in this crisis with a socialist and revolutionary program geared to the needs of the vast majority, not the interests of an obscenely rich and corrupt financial oligarchy. Did that sound really militant enough?
It is. It has. It has the problem of concentrating on the Democrats' massive failures in regard to social programs and the necessity of their getting their act together and opposing the sorts of things that you described in the Trump budget. But at the same time, what we find primarily from the Democrats these days is a reassertion of the Clinton campaign in regard to foreign policy and an attack on Trump for not for being a Russian spy, a Russian asset, an example
Right.
of Russian undue influence in the American government. The morning papers have accounts of the testimony of the former head of the CIA, a man who incidentally was very close to the Saudi regime when he was in the CIA. No, he was in Riyadh for a long time.
Right.
Insisting that, I'm talking about John Brennan, that, and I'm quoting here from the New York Times, that he became concerned last year that the Russian government was trying to influence members of the Trump campaign to act wittingly or unwittingly on Moscow's behalf. Now, this is the nonsense we're getting from the Democrats these days, and the reason they're not doing the sorts of things that you quite rightly described they should be doing in order to oppose Trump's budget. They're much more concerned to make sure that Trump's foreign policy continues the war provocations against Russia and China that the Obama-Clinton administration engaged in. And their reasons for doing it are not quite so clear. What, in fact, they're doing is, I'm afraid, distressingly clear, and it looks like they're succeeding on the basis of what Trump is saying in the Middle East. We should be clear about why the Democrats are doing this, why the Democrats are taking this obviously fake McCarthyist account of the Trump administration and using it in order to coerce the Trump administration into the war provocations of the Obama administration. This is in behalf of the American 1%, the American economic elite, which has been the source of the errand running that the Democrats have done for a long time, including throughout the Obama administration. The long-term concern with keeping up the military pressure on Russia and China from the American elite comes from the fact that the U.S. is that elite is losing its place in the economic dominance of the world that it's essentially had since the Second World War. The meeting in Beijing last week of the BRI, the One Belt, One Road initiative that China is putting together, and the cooperation between Presidents Putin and Xi, Russia and China, scares the American ruling class to death because they realize that their economic domination is being challenged, is being put aside by the economic expansion of Eurasia. And the way of dealing with it that the American ascendancy has used for a long time has been to threaten Russia and China militarily. They thought they'd won in the Clinton administration when the Soviet Union came apart, and it looked like the Soviet Union could be reduced to a third world country with a supplier of raw materials, essentially under the dominance of American capitalism. Well, that hasn't happened. And it didn't happen in part because of the resistance that the Putin government put together. The reason Putin is so hated in Washington is that he forestalled these plans of the American government going back a generation to make sure that the economic subservience of Russia was in place. That's nothing new. That's been American policy literally for a century. But the fact that Russia and China today are opposing that together is causing all sorts of consternation in the American ruling class, and they're particularly concerned if the American president as someone who attacked this hostility to Russia and China during the campaign, as Trump did. Now, Trump seems to have been tamed. Trump seems to have been brought
Yes.
got with the program
Certainly.
because of the sort of pressure that's been put upon him by the Democrats, not just the Democrats, the neocons, the Pentagon,
Right.
the intelligence community, as we're taught to say this. Trump seems to be dancing to their tune now, certainly on this trip to the Middle East. But it's not clear, and the American ruling class, the American ascendancy, the 1%, is worried. And it wants to be sure that the American political parties are in line, as they seem to be. In the meantime, what we should be doing is developing an anti-war and, as you described in that last piece, a pro-social movement in this country that opposes the policies that both political parties are putting forward.
My comment on that would be, my criticism of the World Socialist website would be that they always refer to the working class, and I keep thinking to myself, what about all those people who aren't able to get jobs, decent jobs, and find themselves unemployed? Do we still refer to them as working class?
I would think so. We
I
don't want to make it restrictive.
Yeah, I gather that's their point as well.
Right.
Basically, is that we're those people who have always had to work for a living, as opposed to those people in the upper 1% who don't work. They just take, what is it?
Clip coupons, right?
Well, no, they just get their interest from their financial investments, and that's why the point of Wall Street literally owning us in so many respects. The Wall Street think tank, as Lawrence Shoup's book points out, the Council on Foreign Relations is their organization, and I've pointed out recently that I think that the Occupy movement was successful, even if they didn't reach their ultimate goal. They were successful in bringing like-minded people with issues, okay? Issues that may have been divergent, but nonetheless were related. And they focused on one of the major culprits, which is Wall Street. So in that sense, I think that they were successful. Whereas what we see with the Democrats, and I want to point out, people, I was a Democrat at one time. So when I'm sitting here,
we all have things in our past that we're not pleased about.
well, I actually organized them in Thailand when I was there. I was one of two founders, and they have gone off into being very successful. They're actually quite successful in Thailand, much to my chagrin and theirs when they read my postings, that they see now I've gone over to the left, but that's because I've actually had the time and some of the comrades here to enlighten me as to what the Democrat Party is responsible for. And because while the Republicans are always vilified, okay, they're not the neoliberals, supposedly, I think too many people think that the Democrat Party is the savior. And I think they think that by going out, and we've seen this, I think the mass movements during the inauguration. I mean, I helped organize a mass movement in D.C. during the Nixon inauguration, although it was his second. It was his second term. So I had already seen what he had done in regards to maybe not continuing the war in Vietnam. He actually de-escalated it, but he expanded it, much the same way Obama has done, into Cambodia. And that created, well, we know Kissinger was behind that, but that created the loss of at least 250,000 people, if not 500,000. But I helped organize one at that time, so I'm very much in favor of counter-inaugurals once we've already seen what a president has done. But I was opposed to the counter-inaugural that took place this time because it was based merely upon, what is the word I want to use, speculation as to what this president was going to do, and it had more to do with his personal life and the things that he had said. It became a he said, she said, without focusing on critical issues. So I was opposed to that one. But, and this is what I fear, people are just going to be out there thinking that we have to get the Democrats, because what is taking place that they see, what they see is under a Republican administration and a Republican Congress. Now, I fault Trump for, one, his appointments. I mean, the disastrous appointments. And when I see that he's got Carson, a former candidate, now Carson is talking about China and Asia, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm sorry. Even if he's saying good things,
Actually, it's wonderful the extent to which
yeah,
the the confusion.
yes,
Ben Carson, who's hard to take seriously,
yes,
actually said this week, "Hey, what's all this fuss with China? We
right.
should be trying to do a deal with China."
Exactly. He's saying the right thing,
You
but
know,
it's like, my God,
nobody
why?
can be wrong all the time, you
Yeah,
know, and he's
exactly.
absolutely right about this, and they must have been tearing their hair out in Washington,
Right.
where they're trying to get the hostility to China mounted up. That,
Right,
that
right.
old Ben, you know,
Yeah.
was off again,
Yeah, yeah. He
saying
couldn't,
something
he
great.
couldn't make a sensible statement when he
Exactly.
was a candidate. And I don't know what experience he has to be in the position that he holds. But then, of course, we've got Betsy DeVos, head of education. I don't want to go there, but I do hold Trump responsible for his actions. And now he has capitulated to the powers that be. And this is what I think people have got to recognize. It's not about who is the president, because there's evidence to prove that they all capitulate to the powers that be. And we basically have a one-party system. And that is why I support the Green Party, because it's the only alternative out there to what we currently have. Now, but make no mistake, I don't have a lot of faith in electoral politics. So I think that the only hope really is mass movements. Nonviolent, okay, just to clarify that. So this is, and the reason I criticize the Democrats so much is because I was one time, until I really had the time to really research and to look into what has been taking place. And to me, the big elephant in the room, okay, which we say cannibalizes everything, is our neoliberal corporate capitalist system that we have. And all of the domestic problems that we are facing are related to our foreign policy. I gather at one time, Carl, it was the opposite. At one time, it was like domestic policy often drove foreign policy, that presidents wanted war to take the onus off of their domestic problems. I'm not clear on that. You're the historian.
Yeah,
but I definitely see foreign policy being the driver of everything today.
Yeah, I think they're bound up, obviously. But you're certainly right that if we look at the history of American wars, even for the last century or so, it's very clear that the wars have been in the interest of the American ruling class and have been opposed by the majority, who had to be dragged kicking and screaming into both the First and Second World Wars and the post-World War II. Remember, at the beginning of the 20th century, 100 years ago, Woodrow Wilson got himself elected president for a second time with the slogan, "He kept us out of war."
Okay.
The point was that there was a war going on in Europe, and most Americans wanted to have nothing to do with except the economic ascendancy of the United States, New York bankers and others, who saw a great opportunity. I think the American weapons makers, what we call the defense industry today, were involved as well, and they looked at the war as a great profit opportunity for American business, particularly financial and industrial. But the majority of the population didn't want to have anything to do with it, and Wilson knew that to become president, he had to get with that program. So his slogan was, he kept us, Wilson, kept us out of war. Now, immediately he was reelected, he resumed his scheming to get the U.S. into the war, which he accomplished in 1917, in fact, by throwing a good bit of the anti-war movement into jail. Most notably Gene Debs, but the attempt to suppress the political forces in the United States that were expressing the real views of Americans, that was at the heart of U.S. joining the First World War. Okay, it went on through the century. The scheming of the Roosevelt administration to get the U.S. into the Second World War is worth recalling too. I've recommended the excellent book Human Smoke as an account of one of the first honest accounts I think we've seen in more than half a century of how the U.S. got involved in the Second World War. The American mythology on this is overwhelming. Americans rose up and launched a crusade against the concentration camps, according to what most Americans believe about it. Had nothing to do with the Second World War, had nothing to do with what the U.S. was doing in the Pacific, which had a long history before that. So the question, the anti-war attitude of the American populace, historically, all the time, is absolutely clear. And what is also clear is the scheming of the American ruling class to get the U.S. into wars, which has been remarkably successful in Vietnam, in Korea, in Southwest Asia, even in Europe, in Serbia. So the understanding of how America goes to war and whose interests are served by America going to war should be brought to bear on the question of the war making that the U.S. is doing right now in the Middle East. Barack Obama is the first American president ever to have been at war through 2 full presidential terms, and his wars are being continued by the Trump administration. That's the real domestic political problem in America. Is Trump going to be able to be forced to do what Obama did? And the answer seems to be yes.
I think it's absolutely yes. I never doubted it. Let's turn to the pivot to Asia now.
Okay.
I brought in this new map and pen just so I could demonstrate. You wanted me to talk a little bit about the Rohingya, which is basically the name, and it's a derogatory name, but then of course we use derogatory names for a lot of people. We refer to the Hill tribe people in Thailand that fought on behalf of the U.S. In Vietnam. Often we refer to them as the Miao, which is derogatory, but maybe that's because I'm coming from Asia and I use Asian terms sometimes. The Rohingya are the Muslims of northern Burma. And here again, it's now called Myanmar, okay. They have experienced discrimination for many years, but I think it was only recent that, that in maybe the 90s, I think it was the late 90s or the early 2000s, that it was clarified that they would definitely not have Burmese nationality, okay. At some point. So they lost their nationality. They were always called immigrants from Bangladesh, okay, because they're Muslims. But the fact is, and I know this for a fact, and anyone who looks into their history of it, these people had been residing in northern Burma going back to the days of the Kublai Khan, okay? More recent ones may be coming from Bangladesh, but here's the issue. The Burmese military government has been slaughtering them. And this has been really in mass numbers, and the provocations are being fomented by some monk, okay, which may shock us because we think of Buddhist monks as being a very peaceful people, which the people are. But it's like any religion, you will often have opportunists involved who, for the right amount of money and power, they will do what their handlers tell them to do, which is what we've been talking about with presidents. And the military controls this monk, and he's led a lot of the mass slaughtering, sometimes by the people, but it's the military fomenting it. And one of the issues that came up, I think was 2 years ago, it became really, really obvious and bad and really horrific, their slaughter of innocents. And even one of my Burmese friends, an exile who had been fighting the Burmese government, a Buddhist, was outraged. He was absolutely outraged. He said, you know, the Muslims of Burma, he said, they supported us against the government. I mean, he was just outraged, and we couldn't find an answer for it. Now, I see an answer, okay? I know why it's being done, and it's because of the location. It's in the north, and this is where I'm going to try to draw it on the map. My eyesight's not that good. This map, hopefully, is large enough that I can see what I'm doing. If we look at Burma, Myanmar, Yangon, this is, the capital is Mandalay, which is right here, okay? Now, this is the border, okay? And the border is on China. And one of the things I do want to point out, we often talk, and I think it's important, that all of what the U.S. is doing is for the resources. of nations, okay? Specifically oil. Number one is oil. Yes, that's one goal. The second goal is also control, simply control and containment of those that threaten us, which is Russia and China. And this has been the goal since back, Carl, I always say World War II, but actually it goes back to, what is it, Alistair or what's his last name? It goes back before George Kennan. It goes back to the turn of the century. The goal of controlling China
Oh, you're thinking
and
of the
Eurasia.
Mackinder thesis?
Mackinder. I
Yes.
forgot his name.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, Mackinder thesis. Okay, I don't know if it shows on the map, but when you realize that Burma and Bangladesh, all right, now Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, is down here. But if you realize the border, here again, of Bangladesh, and why I've been seeing some problems in Bangladesh of late, and I think that terrorist activities, okay? But when you recognize that the north and the northeast, okay, which is here, all right, how this impacts upon China, and why clearing out the Muslims, all right, is a goal of the military of Burma and their Western influences. And it relates back to, I call it OBOR still, which is, or the Silk Road, the high-speed rail that China is building. And their goal was to go right through Burma, okay? If they were able to do that, say from China, let's just say Chengdu. We won't even worry about Shanghai or Shandong or any of those. We'll just look at Chengdu and draw it through the northeast or the north, through Burma. There you are. You're on the Indian Ocean, okay? But that was killed by Western influences. They actually had, I think the Chinese actually had a contract for that. Now we know China is building right up through Kazakhstan, all the way through Europe. They've got things going on like with India and Pakistan. They've got strong ties now with Pakistan, everywhere. And now, just recently, I read where they're finally going ahead with the rail through Thailand, and which is interesting because it's supposed to go up through Nong Khai, which is on the border of Laos, and through Laos. So, but when you recognize the location and why a Western power, and I was told this by sources that certainly know what they're talking about. In fact, they quoted the head of the railroads of Burma, and this was confidential information. Of course, I'm on TV reporting it, but I'm not mentioning names. But basically, it was killed by a Western power. Well, we know who the Western power is. It's the U.S. The U.S. has been supporting the NLD. That's the National League of Democracy. That is Aung San Suu Kyi's political party. And I was a major supporter of them in respect to the exiles who were living in Thailand, the students who had to flee in 1988 when they had an uprising against their government. The government killed so many people. So they took up became a paramilitary group on the border, crossing the border of Thailand. They were, and now one is working as a peace advocate. And this to me is rather startling because one of the things his goal is, they actually sent him to Colombia to meet with people. His goal now, I mean, we're talking about people now, they're no longer students in their 20s, they're now in their 50s, is to get the ethnics, all the ethnic people who occupy Burma. And we're talking about, oh, I'd have to look it up how many people there are, but like 12 of those ethnic groups have signed an agreement which would lead to peace, all right, supposedly. But now I have an article here by Bertil Lintner, who I knew in Bangkok. He is an expert on Burmese politics, on Burmese government. He's written books on this. I've met with him. He knows very well. He's been in the jungles. He's worked with, specifically with the Shan. And bottom line, there are I think there are 4 to 6 that are holding out now. I can't really read it, that are holding out now. And he's actually come up now and said, well, why would they? The agreement is strictly to get them to lay down their arms, the ethnic groups, all right? But it doesn't state anything that would lead to the military government to stop what they've been doing, what they've been imposing. And what these ethnic groups want is they do want autonomy. They want their own states, and they were at one time their own states, and they want to maintain that. And when you know the history of what the Burmese military has been doing over the years, and we're going back to World War II, okay, when they were first fighting the Japanese. And then some of the ethnic groups like the KNU, that's the Karen National Union, who were organized by Aung San Suu Kyi's father at the time, fought, and then they were betrayed by the Burmese government, the military government. So these ethnic groups have a very good reason to distrust the government. And so I support their holding out. Now, it's also said that China is supporting these ethnics with weapons. I have no doubt they are, and probably have since at least World War II. And why wouldn't they? Because of the location. Now, someone might say to me, oh, well, you don't support the idea of the U.S. supporting rebels in Syria. No, I don't, because number one, many of them are not really rebels. Many of them are terrorists that we have trained and armed. Many of them are people that simply, first of all, what are we doing? What is the U.S.? We have no real vested interest in Syria. They're not on our border, okay? China has a vested interest in keeping their borders from having terrorist overflow. When you're on the same landmass, it does become, or in your same neighborhood, or somebody who's on your border. I mean, yeah, if someone was suddenly bringing in arms, say one of our European allies suddenly decided to turn on us and bring in and set up weapons on the border of Canada or Mexico, we would have just cause to be concerned. Excuse me. But so what is happening is chaos, literally chaos. And this has been predicted by others, I'm speculating, but it's been predicted by others who know the region even far better than I do, that the U.S. goal is to create chaos. And right now, they are supplying all these weapons that we've been talking about, billions of dollars, to the Saudis. And the Saudis supposedly are supporting the Rohingya now with weapons, okay, and training in Saudi Arabia. Now, the question is, are they really Rohingya? Some people doubt that very much, that they're really Rohingya, who are probably the poorest people in the world, okay? And but at the same time, they might be, because they are the most vulnerable people in the world, given now that they're almost stateless. So even if they are being supported with weapons against the military government of Burma, which you have to ask, why? How is that going to save them? It probably is not, because their families and people are already being destroyed. What it's going to do, it's going to create more chaos throughout that whole region. And from what I understand, chaos is also the goals that the U.S. have for Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all of the stands, okay? We're going to see more and more ethnic revolts or drug-related problems, meaning war on drugs. That's what we're seeing in the Philippines. Duarte of the Philippines was given huge funds of money, I talked about this once before, in order to clean up the drug problem, and they do have a really terrible drug problem. But he's just gone out and killed at least 3,000 people without trial, without due process. Now, Thaksin in Thailand, I think it was back around 2007, I can't remember the exact date, did exactly the same thing in the south of Thailand, which is where the Muslims reside. Okay, they just started killing people over the drug issue. So chaos can be created. What have we done with Mexico? Okay, either by creating drug problems and drug wars, or it can be created by creating ethnic strife. And that's how you create chaos. And when you create chaos, it makes it very difficult for anyone to function. It makes it very easy for intervention by outside world powers.
Thank you, Karen. I think that what this complicated story should...
Sorry.
No, I'd
It
say
is
the story is complicated. You're absolutely right. Should lead us to reflect on is what the U.S. is actually doing about what President Trump calls radical Islamic terrorism. It is in fact radical Islamic terrorism that both China and Russia are concerned about within their own borders or in neighboring countries, as Karen has just explained for China. And in Russia, of course, in Chechnya and so forth, the radical Islamic terrorism has been a principal problem of the Putin regime. Now, the problem with this, as Karen said, is that a good bit of this terrorism is a result of support from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's export of Wahhabism, the puritanical and belligerent form of Islam that is sponsored by the Saudi government. So here the U.S. is making nice with the Saudis and condemning radical Islamic terrorism when the Saudis are the principal support of radical Islamic terrorism, not only in the Middle East, but also in Russia and China. Now, if you're sitting in Beijing or in Moscow looking at this, I mean, you realize that a most amazing propaganda curtain is being drawn over American foreign policy, and that it's almost impossible to push that curtain aside, certainly within the United States itself. Our first task as Americans, as our government tells us we've got to go kill people in some parts of the world, is to try to understand whose interests are being served, why the U.S. government thinks it necessary to kill these people, and who it is that they're really working for. It seems to me we've had a good example of that in the Trump's visit to the Middle East this week, but you won't find a clear account of it in the American media, unfortunately. That's our task here, by the way, in Aware on the Air, to try to give you a clear account of the sort of crimes that the U.S. is committing around the world. That's the issue.
Well, I started about sushi, and I think it does need to be pointed out that some of us have been very disappointed in her performance since she's been in power, but she's more of a figurehead. That's the problem. She lacks the real power, and they've used her as a figurehead, and she has never once come out and condemned the killing of the Muslims in Burma. In fact, when she was asked to speak on it by someone where she was speaking, she refused to comment on it, and she was like, well, that's not my issue, or that's not my problem, or something. She was very dismissive of it. And so people who have been her supporters, like myself, for a very long time, are very, very disappointed. And, you know, it's like someone who has been so heroic personally, being under house arrest for, 23, 27 years, I've forgotten, and then to... you know, there's a saying, you lay down with dogs, you get fleas, okay? I mean, that's the way it is. And it's like you want to work with this military government. And my friend, who had been one of the original student organizers, set up the paramilitary group on the border. I think this goes back 2 years ago. He said one of the reasons he was back in Thailand, I don't think he's returned to the U.S., it was that he is Burmese, is that he was literally kicked out because he wouldn't shut his mouth. And he said, because he was in Parliament with her, with Aung San Suu Kyi, working with her on these issues, he would be elected, I think, to any position. He has such a following there. But he refuses to, you know, be co-opted by the government. So he was told he was persona non grata, and when a military government tells you you're persona non grata, you better leave. especially the Burmese government. And they are the same people. They'll change a couple people, but if you look at their connections, their family connections and community, you realize that they're basically the same people. There were a couple other things that I wanted to refer to on this, and I think it has to do with looking at, like you've always said, it was under the Jimmy Carter administration, due to Brzezinski's being his advisor at the time, that we armed the Taliban to give Russia their Vietnam in Afghanistan. And out of that has grown Al-Qaeda and moved on with ISIS and whatnot. So this is really, well, many people are probably thinking, well, what has this got to do with us, what is happening, say, in a tiny little country like Burma? Because it explodes. It expands, it explodes, and we are looking at further and more wars and more terrorism, more lone wolf terrorism, which we're seeing in Europe. And fortunately, we haven't seen too much of it here. But I just wonder how long we'll be able to go.
In the last few minutes here, we'd look at some other parts of the world. The newly founded Black Alliance for Peace in the U.S. and the United National Anti-War Coalition, another new attempt to assert an anti-war position in the confused political atmosphere of the United States. They issued a joint statement denouncing U.S. destabilization and attempts to cause regime change, as they said, in Venezuela.
Oh.
They write, quote, "We share the objective to revive the anti-war movement, the anti-imperialist movement in the U.S., said the organizer Ajamo Baraka, who was the vice presidential candidate of the Green Party in the last election and is a major organizer of this new Black Alliance for Peace." He says, quote, "We are, of course, committed to peace, but we understand there can be no peace without justice, and that means people have to be prepared for struggle." He's referring specifically to Venezuela, and that is a story also that is not reported in this country. The U.S. is essentially trying to overthrow the government in Venezuela and is making great strides, unfortunately, in that direction. The confusion of American progressives is not, unfortunately, limited to Latin America or Asia. Purported progressives, apparently driven mad by Donald Trump, say these folks, demonstrated this month in support of former FBI Director James Comey. Quote, "It was disheartening to see left forces so anxious to combat Trump, they were actually supporting Comey," said UNAC activists. UNAC is the United National Anti-War Coalition I'm quoting here, said their activist Sarah Flounders. "This strange strain of leftists seem to have forgotten the oppressive history and practice of U.S. spy outfits. Quote, "We have to be clear, all of these agencies are about absolute repression, subversion, and assassination," close quote. And it's these groups that are now being cried up, now being praised by progressives in the U.S., self-styled progressives in the U.S. We have to get some clarity on these issues. These people are not our friends. John Brennan and James Comey are exactly the people that we should be opposing, and the notion that they're somehow exposing Russian plots in America has got to be one of the most fantastic stories of American politics, and that's saying a lot.
Well, is it Colleen Raleigh? She's a former FBI agent who is seen frequently on RT, was recently on The Real News, which is a U.S. news online program, and she was talking about Comey and Mueller and the fact that they actually have good relations, et cetera, et cetera. But she was pointing out that Comey, I mean, you know, they call him honest, and they say he's, forget it. She's pretty much, I won't go into the detail, but none of these people are really ethical, let's put it that way. They all pretty much do what their masters tell them, and their masters are our corporate systems, whether when we refer to the deep state, what we're really talking about is, yes, the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, the Council on Foreign Relations, which represents all of the elites. It's a really, really frightening scenario. And I quote Chris Hedges when he said that we have to. It's not our role to take power, to acquire power. It's our role to. Our goal should be to scare the shit out of power. But I think we've reached the point where now. As that book you were going to mention today, if we'd had time, written by somebody by the name of Schmucker, yeah, Phil Schmucker or something, and
They make jelly, don't they?
somebody by the name of Levine reported or did a review on Counterpunch, and it's definitely worth reading, just a review if nothing else, and it was about not being afraid to take power, not being afraid of power. And I fear we may have reached the stage where that may be the only answer.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 21st week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just attacks like the attack by ISIS in Manchester, England, this last day, and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scolleray. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana for articles referred to tonight. Mm-hmm. Finally, and I should say a word about upcoming events.
This Saturday, we will be at the market at the Lincoln Mall parking lot. This Saturday.
Oh,
this Saturday.
This Saturday. Okay, yeah.
Good. The following week,
very good.
Saturday,
good
2 o'clock in the afternoon, we'll be holding our monthly demonstration downtown Champaign on the corner of Church and Neal.
Excellent. And our presence at the market is primarily a matter of distributing literature, combined talk about the issues we're speaking about tonight, and related matters if you like. We'll have members of Aware there, mm-hmm. and a collection of improving literature, I assure you. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. One of the articles I will put on the Aware Facebook page is an excellent analysis of the case of Julian Assange by John Pilger, the Australian journalist, that should be read. It is a refutation of what you're hearing from the American media about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Now, finally, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, David Johnson, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.